The federal government does not move fast. That is the one thing that everybody who has been watching this situation needs to understand before we go any further. The feds do not scramble. They do not react to tweets. They do not care about comment sections. What they are extraordinarily good at, is building a case so airtight over months and years that by the time anyone outside of a small room in a federal building knows something is happening, it is already over. And right now, if the information that has been surfacing over the last several months is even half accurate, there are people in the city of Toronto, people in the city of Los Angeles, and people in the United States federal system who are sitting on information about OVO Sound, about Drake's Inner Circle, and about the connections between one of the most commercially successful music brands in history, and not one, but allegedly two separate criminal organizations, one of which has been formally linked to violence on Canadian streets for decades. This is not speculation from a corner blog. This is not a Reddit thread. The names being attached to this story, the organizations being named in the same sentence as the OVO brand, and the pattern of behavior that has been documented publicly over the course of Aubrey Drake Graham's entire career. It is all pointing in a direction that nobody in mainstream media wants to say out loud. So I am going to say it. And I'm also going to address this absolutely absurd claim that Kendrick Lamar, the man who literally just had the biggest cultural moment in hip-hop in a decade, needed to manufacture a publicity stunt to get people in Los Angeles to listen to his own music in his own city, after winning a war that the entire internet watched in real time. That claim is so disconnected from reality that it almost does not deserve a response. But we're going to give it one, because the person making it needs to understand something fundamental about what Kendrick Lamar actually built and why GNX landed the way it did. We have a lot to cover today. The connections run deeper than anyone has fully mapped out. And by the time we are done, you are going to understand exactly why so many people who track this closely are not surprised, and why the Drake stans who keep saying nothing is going to happen have never actually looked at how RICO cases are built from the ground up. Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like, and subscribe. Let's get into it. Let us start with the architecture of this situation, because if you came into this video only knowing the surface-level version of the story, you need a full foundation before we get to what has just emerged. Drake, Aubrey Drake Graham, Champagne Papi, the man who spent the better part of a decade building himself into the face of Toronto rap, and then into one of the most commercially dominant artists in music history, has not operated in a vacuum. Nobody at that level does. But what makes the OVO situation particularly significant, and what has had people in both music industry circles and law enforcement adjacent communities talking for years, is the specific nature of the relationships that have been publicly documented around the brand. OVO Sound is the label. OVO is the lifestyle brand, the clothing line, the festival. It is an empire built on the back of Drake's commercial success. But empires have people running them, people protecting them, and people orbiting them. And the people who have been documented in orbit around OVO over the years include individuals whose relationship with criminal activity goes well beyond what you would expect from a music business operation. We have talked about this on this channel before, and I want to be clear from jump that what I am doing is analyzing publicly reported information and documented connections, not inventing a narrative. But the narrative that has been building from documented, reported facts is significant enough that we need to have this conversation seriously, not as a gossip topic, but as a genuine question about what the legal and cultural consequences of these connections could ultimately be. The stakes here are not small. We are talking about the potential application of RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the same legal framework that brought down entire organized crime families, that has been used against rap organizations ranging from YSL to what surrounded the 6ix9ine situation, to what is arguably the most prominent music brand in the history of Canadian hip-hop. That is a big statement. And the reason it is being made is because the evidence trail that has been documented publicly is starting to look less like coincidence and more like pattern. And on the other side of the story, we have Kendrick Lamar, K-Dot, the Compton King, the man who just sold out Rogers Centre in Toronto not once but twice, setting the record for the highest-grossing hip-hop concert in Canadian history, being accused by an LA artist of pulling a publicity stunt with GNX to get Los Angeles to stream his music. A man who grew up in Compton, who has spent his entire career being embraced by Los Angeles, who just performed at the Super Bowl halftime show in one of the most culturally dominant sets in the history of that platform, needed a stunt to get LA to stream him. We will get to exactly why that narrative is not just wrong, but almost comically wrong in a way that tells you everything about who is making that claim and why. But first, the OVO connection that Trapper Ross and others have been detailing, because it is more layered than even the recent coverage has indicated. Now let us get into the first layer of what has been publicly reported and what the documented evidence actually shows, because this is where the story gets real. The Hells Angels connection. This is not new information to anyone who has been paying close attention to this story, but for those who are just now catching up, let us lay it out clearly. The Hells Angels Motorcycle Club is not a civic organization. It has been formally designated as an outlaw motorcycle gang by law enforcement agencies in multiple countries, and in Canada specifically, the organization has a documented history that includes organized crime, drug trafficking, extortion, and violence spanning decades. The connection between Drake's inner circle and the Hells Angels was not something that had to be invented. It was something that was made visible publicly, in part because of a moment at a Canadian music festival, where an individual alleged to have Hells Angels affiliations was involved in a physical confrontation involving someone connected to Ross, and in part because of a photograph. A photograph that Drake himself posted, according to multiple outlets that covered this story, showing a Hells Angels logo visible on a laptop in his possession. Now, I want to be careful here, because a photograph of a logo is not a RICO indictment. But what it is, and what the pattern of documented associations around the OVO brand represents, is the kind of publicly visible signal that investigators actually do pay attention to. And when you layer on top of that the newer information being surfaced by Trapper Ross about G-Way gang connections, a street gang with alleged roots in Toronto that has reportedly been involved in serious violent crime, now you are no longer talking about one connection to one organization. You are talking about what law enforcement calls a pattern of association. And patterns are exactly what RICO cases are built from. The second piece of evidence that cannot be brushed aside is the documented presence of specific individuals in Drake's inner circle, whose histories have been publicly reported in ways that go far beyond what any music executive would typically be comfortable with. We are talking about individuals like Tyshawn Riley, known as Greasy Money, whose alleged connection to violent crime has been reported by outlets covering Toronto's criminal landscape in significant detail. Drake has been publicly vocal in his support of Riley. This is documented, it has been reported. And that public association, in the context of a potential RICO investigation, is the kind of thing that prosecutors look at very carefully. Then there is the documented history of other individuals who have been confirmed members of Drake's entourage, and who carry criminal records that include charges that go beyond the ordinary. This is not me inventing a narrative. This is reported, documented information that exists in the public record, and that any serious legal analysis of the OVO situation has to account for. Does everybody understand what we are actually looking at here? This is not the usual hip-hop adjacent celebrity drama where someone has a friend with a record. This is a pattern documented across years of a music brand's inner circle having alleged ties to multiple distinct criminal organizations simultaneously. And the third piece of surface evidence, and this one is important, is the way the language around OVO has shifted even within hip-hop culture over the last 2 years. Since the beef with Kendrick Lamar exploded into the open, since Not Like Us and all of the allegations that came out in that period became part of the public conversation, the nature of what is being alleged about OVO has moved from whisper to mainstream discussion in a way that it never was before. And the reason that matters from a legal standpoint is simple. Visibility creates accountability. The feds have the same internet we do. They always have. And when the mainstream conversation starts including the words RICO, gang affiliations, and OVO in the same breath, with receipts attached, you have to ask yourself, if we are seeing this, what are they seeing? And oh, do I have more for you? Because the stands who keep showing up in comment sections saying this is all just gossip, and nothing is ever going to happen, are about to have a very uncomfortable next few minutes. The next layer of the story involves what has been happening around Drake specifically in the aftermath of the beef, including moves he has been making that people in the industry are reading in a very specific way, and a piece of information about the Lefty Gunplay situation that reframes the entire GNX conversation in a way that nobody who is calling it a publicity stunt has actually thought through. Stay right here. This is where the real story starts. Let us move into the cultural evidence layer. Because what the people close to this situation have been saying publicly, on record, on camera, is actually more revealing than the documentary evidence by itself. Start with a Lefty Gunplay story, because this one is extraordinary, and it has not gotten anywhere near the attention it deserves in the context of the Drake versus Kendrick narrative. Lefty Gunplay was featured on GNX, a Kendrick Lamar album that debuted to enormous commercial and critical success, and that many people are calling one of the defining rap albums of recent years. The feature introduced Lefty Gunplay to a massive audience. It got him on one of the biggest platforms in hip-hop, and Lefty's manager has gone on record to detail what happened after GNX dropped. Specifically, what Drake's camp allegedly tried to do in response. According to the account given by Lefty's management, a producer connected to OVO Studios reached out and tried to get Lefty on a Drake record. This happened not once but twice. First in the immediate aftermath of TV Off, and then again after the Grammys, when Drake's camp allegedly sent a message saying, "All we need is 4 words from Lefty." Let me repeat that for the people in the back. 4 words. They wanted 4 words from an artist whose entire visibility exploded because Kendrick Lamar put him on a record. And when Lefty's team was initially entertaining the conversation to see what OVO was actually offering, the moment it became clear what was being proposed, they stopped communicating. Because what was being proposed was not a genuine musical collaboration. What was being proposed, as Lefty's team framed it clearly, was an attempt to use Lefty as a chess piece, a way for Drake to co-opt a Kendrick-adjacent artist and turn him into a narrative tool in a beef that Drake had clearly lost on every measurable level. That is cultural evidence. That is insider evidence. That tells you something about the mindset of the OVO camp right now and why the move's being made feel increasingly desperate in ways that the business layer of this story is going to make even clearer. The second piece of cultural evidence is what Kendrick Lamar's documented impact in Los Angeles actually looks like. Because before we can fully dismantle the GNX was a publicity stunt claim, you have to understand the baseline. Kendrick Lamar sold out Rogers Centre in Toronto back-to-back. In Canada, on tour, he set the highest-grossing hip-hop concert record in Canadian history, in a city where, if you believe the Drake narrative, the entire crowd should have been showing up to boo him. Instead, 60 to 80,000 people sang every word of every song back to him, word for word, in a venue that loud. That is not a publicity stunt result. That is a generational artist result. The third piece of cultural evidence is the way the hip-hop community at large, not Drake's fanbase, but the broader community, has responded to the idea that GNX was manufactured. The response has been almost uniformly dismissive. Artists who have been around long enough to know how LA hip-hop works, commentators who have actual roots in the community, and fans who have watched Kendrick's entire career trajectory have all said the same thing. The idea that Kendrick needed a stunt to get LA to listen is not just wrong. It is an insult to the relationship that Lamar has built with his city over 20-plus years of work. And then there is the fourth piece of cultural evidence, which is the specific reaction to the claim that Kendrick did not pay Lefty Gunplay enough for his contribution. This argument was made publicly, the suggestion being that GNX was essentially an exploitation of Lefty's street credibility and community ties without adequate financial compensation. And here is where I want to give a counter-argument its fair hearing before I dismantle it, because intellectual honesty matters. Is it reasonable to ask whether all the artists featured on a major commercial album are being fairly compensated? Absolutely. That is a legitimate question in any business context. But the framing of Kendrick used Lefty to get the essays to stream GNX collapses under any serious examination. Because what GNX did for Lefty Gunplay, the exposure, the Grammy stage appearance, the global platform, is not something that $10,000 buys. It is not something that $100,000 buys. The exposure that comes from being on a triple platinum album by one of the most critically acclaimed rappers alive is a career-altering event. And what an artist does with that event is on them. The suggestion that Kendrick Lamar needed Lefty Gunplay more than Lefty Gunplay benefited from Kendrick Lamar is not analysis. It is either resentment or confusion about how the music industry actually works. Which brings us to the system level. Because the system level of this story is where everything that looks like individual beef or individual business decisions starts to look like something much bigger and much more structurally important. Here is where we need to shift gears completely. Because what looks from the outside like a hip-hop beef story and a celebrity brand story is actually, when you examine it through the lens of how the music industry operates, how RICO cases are built, and what the documented history of prosecutions involving the music industry actually looks like, a story about the way power, money, criminal infrastructure, and public image collide at the highest level of the entertainment business. Let us start with the RICO framework itself, because a lot of people throw this word around without understanding what it actually requires. The Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act was originally designed to go after organized crime families, specifically to address the problem of prosecuting organizations rather than just individuals, because organized crime is structured precisely to insulate leadership from direct criminal culpability. The boss does not pull the trigger. The boss does not make the call, but the boss benefits, directs, enables, and maintains the organization that does all of those things. The legal standard for RICO requires proving that an enterprise exists, that the enterprise engaged in a pattern of racketeering activity, and that the defendant participated in the conduct of the enterprise's affairs through that pattern. What is critical to understand is that the enterprise does not have to be formally constituted. It does not need a charter. It does not need business cards. What it needs is a pattern of relationships and a pattern of criminal behavior that the prosecution can connect through evidence. And here is what makes the OVO situation particularly interesting from a systemic standpoint. The music business, as an enterprise, already has an organizational structure. It has a hierarchy. It has financial flows that are documented. It has contracts that establish relationships. If a prosecutor wanted to build a RICO case around OVO and could document that criminal activity benefited the organization, even indirectly, the organizational structure of the record label itself could theoretically serve as the enterprise through which that argument is made. This is not a theory I am inventing. This is exactly the argument that was made in the Young Thug and YSL case in Georgia. That was a state RICO, not federal, but the structure of the argument was identical. That a music label's organizational infrastructure was being used to maintain and benefit a criminal enterprise. And it resulted in one of the most significant prosecutions in hip-hop history. The second systemic angle here is the question of what visibility does to a case. I said earlier that the feds have the same internet we do, and this is true, but it understates the point. Federal investigative resources are not limited to what is publicly visible. They have informants. They have wiretaps. They have forensic financial analysis capabilities that can trace money through corporate structures that would take an ordinary person years to untangle. What the public conversation does, what videos like this one, what the Kendrick Lamar diss tracks, what the reporting from outlets that have been covering the OVO criminal connections do, is create a paper trail of public acknowledgement that makes it harder for anyone to later claim they did not know. When Drake posted that photo, when associates of OVO made public statements that confirmed relationships with organizations that have documented criminal histories, when the connections became part of the mainstream conversation, all of that becomes part of the documented public record that investigators can point to. And the third systemic angle, and this is the one that I think people miss most consistently, is the prosecutorial incentive structure. I have talked about this before, and I'm going to say it again clearly. Prosecutors are not robots. They are ambitious human beings with career trajectories. And a RICO case against a figure with Drake's level of public profile would be, from a career-building standpoint, one of the most significant cases a federal or state prosecutor could bring in the current era. The notoriety that comes from prosecuting a case of that magnitude, the press coverage, the legal precedent, the public profile, is enormous. And when you combine that prosecutorial incentive with the documented pattern of associations that has been building in the public record for years, and when you add the visibility that the beef with Kendrick brought to those connections, you have a situation where the question is not whether the government is capable of building a case. The question is whether they have decided to. And what people who track federal investigations will tell you is that by the time that decision becomes visible from the outside, by the time there are raids and indictments, the decision was made a long time ago, the case was already built, and what you are watching is the execution of a plan that was put in motion years earlier. The feds do not move fast, but when they move, they do not miss. Here is the truth bomb. And I want you to understand that everything we have covered up to this point, the documented associations, the Hells Angels connections, the G-Way gang links, the prosecutorial incentive structure, the way RICO has been applied to music industry organizations before, all of it has been building toward this single, central truth that nobody in the mainstream conversation has been willing to say clearly. What is allegedly happening around OVO is not a situation that Drake stumbled into by accident. The pattern of associations that has been documented across years, across multiple organizations, across multiple individuals who have been publicly linked to serious criminal activity, represents a deliberate cultivation of a particular kind of power. This is the 6ix9ine dynamic at a much higher level of sophistication and with much higher stakes. When 6ix9ine, Tekashi 69, the human cartoon who turned his entire legal catastrophe into a cautionary tale in real time, went from a viral rapper to an actual participant in the 9 Trey Gangsta Bloods, the progression was visible and obvious and ultimately catastrophic for him. What he could not resist was the identity that came with Real Street Association, the credibility, the sense of belonging to something with actual force behind it. And what many observers have been noting about the OVO situation is a parallel dynamic operating at a significantly higher level of wealth, sophistication, and deniability. Drake has built his entire post-Degrassi identity around a certain kind of toughness. Mob Ties was not just a song. It was a brand positioning statement. And when you spend years positioning yourself as adjacent to real power, real force, real street credibility, when that identity becomes load-bearing for your entire commercial persona, the relationships that come with maintaining that identity become real, regardless of whether they were initially performative. The G-Way gang connection that Trapper Ross has been detailing is allegedly not just a matter of associates having associates who have gang ties. The claim, and this needs the allegedly caveat loudly and clearly, is that there are individuals in Drake's immediate orbit, not distant associates, but people who are part of the operational inner circle of the OVO enterprise, who maintain active relationships with G-Way gang members. Not former members, not distant relatives of members, active connections. And if that claim is accurate, if the documented evidence that reportedly exists behind what has been publicly surfaced actually shows what Trapper Ross and others have been suggesting, then you have a situation where OVO is not just a music label with some unsavory adjacencies. You have a situation where the alleged organization that surrounds OVO has a documented pattern of relationships with not one but two criminal organizations, where money has reportedly flowed through the OVO infrastructure in ways that investigators could theoretically trace, and where the leadership of that infrastructure, meaning Drake himself, has publicly and repeatedly amplified and associated with the individuals at the center of these connections. That is, by structural definition, the architecture of a RICO case. Not the evidence, necessarily, but the structure, the enterprise, the pattern, the leadership, the alleged criminal activity. It is all there in the publicly available record, which means if investigative resources have been applied to what is not publicly available, to the financial records, to the communications, to the testimony of people who have been positioned to know things, the picture could be significantly more complete than what we can see from the outside. And the fact that this conversation is now happening at a mainstream level, that the words Drake and RICO are appearing in the same sentence in content that reaches millions of people, that is not the cause of a potential investigation. That is the symptom of one that may already be underway. And now let us bring this home, because underneath all of the legal architecture and all of the evidence layers and all of the systemic analysis, there is a human story here that is actually simple. Kendrick Lamar made music. He made music that was true to where he came from, true to the people he came up with, true to the artistic vision he has been developing since he was a teenager in Compton. He made GNX, and he put Lefty Gunplay on it not because he needed Lefty Gunplay to sell records. He did not. But because he wanted to bring somebody from his community onto a platform that could change that person's career, the same way he has always tried to bring LA with him on the way up. The accusation that this was a stunt collapses the moment you look at what GNX actually is. It debuted with no advance warning, no promotional campaign, no manufactured rollout designed to generate artificial buzz. It dropped. And the world reacted the way the world reacts to a generational talent at the height of their powers. Because that is what Kendrick Lamar is. The man sold out Rogers Center in Toronto, Drake's home city, twice. While Drake was doing whatever Drake was doing, 60 to 80,000 people in one room, singing every word of every song. That is not a publicity stunt result. That is a legacy result. That is what happens when you spend 20 years making music that actually means something. While one artist has allegedly been surrounding himself with criminal organizations and positioning his brand around adjacency to real-world violence, and then watching that adjacency threaten to consume everything he built, the other artist has been quietly, methodically building something that does not need the threat of violence to be powerful. It is powerful because it is true. It is powerful because it connects to something real in the people who listen to it. It is powerful because Kendrick Lamar earned it, year by year, record by record, bar by bar. And that is the contrast that this entire situation keeps forcing back into view, no matter how many people try to muddy it. One person's brand is allegedly built on proximity to criminal organizations, and is now facing questions about whether that proximity is legally actionable. The other person's brand is built on proximity to excellence, to truth, to the community that made him. And it just produced one of the most acclaimed albums of the last decade. The feds follow the money. Hip-hop follows the music. And right now, both trails are pointing in the same direction. Here is what comes next. And I want to be very specific about this, because the people saying this will blow over, nothing is going to happen, need to understand what the timeline of federal investigations actually looks like. We are not waiting for a dramatic movie moment where agents show up at the embassy with flashing lights tomorrow morning. That is not how this works. What we are watching right now is the accumulation phase, the phase where public documentation of connections is reaching critical mass, where the mainstream conversation is making it impossible for anyone to later claim they were not paying attention, and where the pattern of behavior by the people involved is either escalating or not in ways that matter enormously to investigators who may already be watching. Two specific things are going to happen in the near future that every person who is following this situation needs to keep their eyes on. The first is the continued fallout from the Kendrick versus Drake beef in terms of the legal and reputational ground that has already been lost. Drake's lawsuit against Universal Music Group and his response to the public allegations that came out during the beef are going to generate documentation. Legal documentation, court filings, public statements that will either support or undermine the narrative he has been trying to maintain. Legal proceedings create paper trails. Paper trails are what investigators read. The second thing to watch is what happens with the specific individuals who have been named in connection with the G-Way allegations and the Hells Angels connections. These are not abstract organizational entities. These are specific people with specific histories. And the decisions those people make in the coming months, the statements they make publicly or semi-publicly, the social media behavior that has already been a problem for everyone adjacent to this situation. All of it is going to continue adding to a public record that is already extensive. Make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss the breakdown when this story moves to its next phase, because it is going to move, and it is going to move in a way that connects directly to everything we have covered today. And speaking of things moving, if you want to understand the full financial architecture of the OVO enterprise and how label deals, publishing ownership, and the specific money flows around Drake's brand could factor into a potential RICO argument, that breakdown is coming very soon. And it is going to reframe everything you think you know about why OVO was built the way it was and who actually controls what. That video is going to be one of the most important pieces of context for understanding how this situation ultimately resolves. And the only way to not miss it is to be subscribed and have notifications on. The truth is in the details. The details are in the money. And the money, as it always does, is about to tell the whole story.